They keep telling you the economy has never been stronger, so why can't you afford your own life? Why does your paycheck vanish before the month is even over? Why is half this country one surprise bill away from losing everything? Why does it now take a six-figure salary just to feel like you are barely keeping your head above water? You have been told everything is fine for so long that you have started to wonder if the problem is you. It is not. Something is really wrong with America right now, and today I am going to show you exactly what. With the cold, hard numbers, they would rather you never sat down and added up. Before we start, do me one favor. Hit like and subscribe so you do not miss what is coming. Let's get into it. Let's start exactly where every honest conversation about this country has to start, with the enormous growing gap between the official story and the life you are actually living. Turn on the news and you will hear that the economy is resilient, that the stock market is near records, that everything is under control. Then you look at your own finances and you wonder if you are losing your mind. You are not. The University of Michigan has been tracking how Americans feel about the economy since the 1950s, and in May of 2026 their Consumer Sentiment Index fell to an all-time record low of 44.8. Not a low for the year, not a low for the decade, the lowest reading ever recorded, worse than the depths of the 2008 financial crisis, worse than the worst of the pandemic. Think about what that actually means. Americans who lived through the Great Recession, who watched their home values collapse and their 401ks get cut in half, felt better about the economy then than they do today. That is not a minor detail. That is a flashing red warning light about the mood of an entire nation. And when researchers asked people why, the answer was overwhelming and simple: the cost of living. The relentless, grinding price of simply being alive in this country. What explains the disconnect is something almost nobody says out loud. When the experts say the economy, they are not talking about your economy. The overall numbers are being propped up by two things that have almost nothing to do with your daily life: a massive corporate spending boom on artificial intelligence, and the runaway spending of the very wealthiest Americans. Moody's Analytics found that the top 10% of earners now account for nearly 50% of all consumer spending in the entire country. Half of everything bought in America is now bought by 1/10 of its households. So when those households are doing well, the headline numbers look strong, even as the bottom 80% of the country quietly falls behind. The economy is not lying to you. It just stopped being about you. Look closer at that strong economy, and you will find even it is barely moving. The Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that the nation's total output grew at an annual rate of just 1.6% in the first quarter of 2026, and the government quietly revised that figure downward from its first estimate, because when they looked closer, both businesses and consumers had spent even less than they thought. The quarter before that, the economy grew a pathetic 0.5%. What little growth there is has been carried almost entirely by a handful of giant technology companies pouring tens of billions into artificial intelligence and the data centers that power it. Strip that narrow corporate boom away, and the economy you actually live in is barely treading water. The people whose job is to forecast all this are nowhere near as calm as the headlines pretend. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, put the odds of a recession in the next year at 49%, a near coin flip, and warned it could easily cross 50 if energy prices stay high. JP Morgan pegged the risk around 35%, the forecasters at EY closer to 40%. Even the famously optimistic Goldman Sachs raised its recession odds. And the Federal Reserve, the institution supposed to steer us out of trouble, is now trapped with inflation climbing again. It has stopped cutting interest rates, and some of its own officials are talking about raising them. So the next time someone tells you everything is fine, remember that the professionals are quietly quoting you odds that sound like a casino floor. Think back for a second to all those confident promises that inflation had been crushed, tamed, sent home for good. Those promises did not survive 2026. In May, the Consumer Price Index climbed 4.2% over the previous year, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That is the fastest pace of inflation in more than 3 years, and the direction is the truly frightening part. Inflation was supposed to be fading toward 2%. Instead, it bottomed out and started climbing again, right back above 4. The wound everyone told you was healing has reopened. You feel it most violently at the gas pump. As of late June 2026, the national average for a gallon of gas sits near $3.93, up roughly 29% from a year earlier, after a Middle East conflict sent oil prices surging. Your electric bill is climbing too, up nearly 6% over the year, rising more than twice as fast as your groceries, and these are not luxuries you can cut. You cannot stop driving to work. You cannot stop cooling your home in the summer. These are the non-negotiable costs of existing, and every one of them is eating a bigger bite out of your paycheck. Speaking of that paycheck, here is the cruelest trick the modern economy plays on you. You can get a raise and still go backward. In the year leading up to May 2026, the average worker's wages rose about 3.5%. Sounds decent, until you remember that prices rose 4.2% over the same stretch. When the cost of your life climbs faster than your pay, your real wages fall, and in 2026 they did exactly that, dropping roughly 0.7% over the year. After inflation, a typical worker's raise amounted to about $3 extra a week. $3. Gone the instant you buy a single gallon of milk. You are running harder than ever, and quietly sliding downhill while you do it. Here is the cruelty the monthly headlines hide. Prices do not reset when inflation cools. They simply stop climbing quite as fast, and the damage stays locked in forever. Add it all up, and the overall cost of living is now roughly 25% higher than it was at the start of this decade. That means the exact same $100 cart of goods from 2020 now runs you about $125 for the identical items. No upgrade, nothing extra. A family that once spent $200 a week to get by is now handing over $250 for the same life, thousands of dollars a year, vanishing with nothing to show for it. The hidden bills bite just as hard. Car insurance has surged, with the average driver now paying around $180 a month, up sharply over the past couple of years. Every renewal notice, every premium, every fee climbs while your paycheck stands still. This is the trap the Federal Reserve cannot solve, and you are the one caught inside it. If it cuts interest rates to help the slowing economy, it risks pouring fuel on the inflation fire. If it keeps rates high to fight inflation, it risks choking off what little growth remains and tipping the country into recession. There is no clean way out of that box, and while the people in charge argue over which mistake to make, you keep paying more for everything, month after month. Beyond the raw numbers, inflation quietly works on the mind in a way the statistics never capture. When prices climb relentlessly, people start to expect them to keep climbing, and that expectation becomes its own force. You rush to buy before things get more expensive. Businesses raise prices preemptively because they assume their costs will rise. Workers demand higher pay just to keep pace. The whole thing can feed on itself, a spiral where the fear of inflation helps create more of it. Surveys show Americans now expect prices to keep rising well above the comfortable level for years to come, and that loss of faith in stable money is corrosive in a way that is hard to reverse. There is also a simple, daily exhaustion to it. Every trip to the store becomes a small negotiation, a quiet calculation of what to give up this week. The mental weight of constantly doing that math, of always feeling slightly behind no matter how careful you are, wears people down in a way that does not show up in any chart, but shows up plainly in how worn out and anxious the whole country has become. Nowhere does this broken promise hit harder or more often than at the grocery store. It is the one bill you cannot escape, the one you face several times a week, and it has become a weekly reminder of how much ground your money has lost. Overall, grocery prices climbed another 3.1% over the past year. But the real shock is waiting at the meat counter. The price of ground beef hit a record of nearly $6.90 a pound in the spring of 2026. A few years ago, that same pound cost under $4. The hamburger, the cheap and reliable dinner that fed working families for generations, has quietly become something people now hesitate over. The reason is structural, which means it is not going away. The U.S. cattle herd has shrunk to its smallest size since the 1960s, hollowed out by years of drought and brutal costs that drove ranchers out of business. You cannot rebuild a national herd overnight, so the Department of Agriculture expects beef prices to climb another 12% across 2026. Coffee is forecast to jump more than 5%. There was one genuine bright spot, and honesty demands we mention it. Egg prices actually fell sharply, down nearly 40% over the year as the bird flu crisis finally eased. But a carton of cheaper eggs is cold comfort when nearly everything else in the cart costs more. Zoom out from your own kitchen and you can see the same pressure crushing the restaurants you used to take for granted. Menu prices are up roughly 31% since early 2020, and even that has not been enough to keep the lights on. In 2025 alone, more than 20 restaurant chains filed for bankruptcy protection, names you would recognize, as families stopped eating out to save money and the math simply stopped working. The shared table, the simple pleasure of a meal somebody else cooked, is quietly becoming a luxury. Widen the lens beyond food to the bill that may scare you most of all: healthcare. The cost of keeping your family healthy has become a crushing weight that arrives before you have spent $1 on anything else. The average employer family health insurance premium climbed to nearly $27,000 a year, with workers themselves paying close to $7,000 of that straight out of their paychecks, and the relief everyone keeps promising is not coming. Large employers are forecasting a cost jump of roughly 9% for 2026, the steepest increase in more than a decade, while insurers in the individual market are requesting double-digit hikes. Every one of those increases gets passed down to you, in a bigger payroll deduction or a thinner plan that covers less. Picture how all of this stacks on a single household. The grocery bill is up, the gas is up, the electricity is up, the car insurance is up, the health premium is up. None of these are choices, none of them are luxuries, and all of them are climbing at once faster than the paycheck that is supposed to cover them. This is what people mean when they say they are working full-time and still falling behind. It is not a character flaw, and it is not bad budgeting. It is simple arithmetic, and right now the arithmetic is rigged against the ordinary American family from every direction at the same time. The shelf prices are only half the trick, too. The other half is something the industry quietly calls shrinkflation, and once you notice it, you cannot stop seeing it. The cereal box that used to hold 18 ounces now holds 14, for the same price. The roll of paper towels has fewer sheets. The bag of chips is suddenly half air. Manufacturers shrink the product instead of raising the sticker, betting you will not notice you are getting less for your money, even though your wallet notices when you run out faster and have to buy again sooner. Between the prices that climb and the packages that quietly shrink, the modern grocery trip drains your budget from two directions at once. The most insidious part is that it is designed to be just subtle enough that you blame yourself for overspending, rather than seeing the squeeze for exactly what it is. On paper, the job market looks like the one part of this story that is still holding together. The unemployment rate sits at 4.3%, which by historical standards is low. But peel back that headline number and you find something quietly rotting underneath. The trouble is not people losing jobs in huge waves. The trouble is what happens when you do not have one. As of May 2026, the typical unemployed American has been out of work for 11.6 weeks, the longest stretch since late 2021. 2 million people have now been jobless for more than half a year, making up more than a quarter of all the unemployed. Another 4.8 million are stuck working part-time because they cannot find the full-time work they need. Economists have a name for this strange frozen labor market: low hire, low fire. Companies are not laying people off in a panic, but they have also quietly stopped hiring. So if you have a job, you are clinging to it, because you can see how hard it has become to land a new one. And if you have lost yours, you are sending out application after application into a void, watching the weeks pile up. The result is a job market that looks calm from a distance and feels like quicksand the moment you are actually in it. That gap between the cheerful 4.3% and the lived reality is exactly the kind of thing that drives consumer confidence to a record low. Dig into who is actually out of work, and the picture darkens further. One of the single largest sources of job losses over the past year was the federal government itself, where roughly 386,000 workers, nearly 9% of the entire federal workforce, were pushed out in a single year of aggressive cuts. For young people, the doors are even harder to open. Unemployment among Americans aged 16 to 24 sits at 9.4%, and for teenagers, it is closer to 15%. Counting everyone who is unemployed, plus those stuck in part-time work who want full-time, plus those too discouraged to keep looking, the real underemployment rate climbs to around 8%, nearly double the cheerful headline figure. Live it for a moment in your imagination, because millions are living it for real. You lose a job that felt secure. You polish the resume. You send out applications. You wait. A week passes, then a month, then 2, then 3. The calls do not come, because the companies that would have hired you have quietly frozen their hiring. Your savings drain. Your confidence erodes. The bills do not pause to wait for you. This is the human face behind that 11.6-week median, and it is a face the unemployment rate was never designed to show. A statistic can look healthy while the people inside it are quietly drowning. Something new is loose in this labor market too, and it is moving faster than almost anyone expected. For the first time, artificial intelligence is not a future threat to jobs. It is a present one, showing up in the layoff numbers right now. The outplacement firm Challenger, Gray and Christmas counted nearly 88,000 job cuts attributed to AI in just the first 5 months of 2026. To put that in perspective, that is already more than the total for all of 2025, packed into less than half a year. In May alone, AI was blamed for 40% of all the cuts announced. This is no longer theoretical, and the companies are saying it out loud. Oracle announced it was cutting around 21,000 jobs and pointed directly at AI in an official filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Amazon cut 16,000 corporate roles, with its CEO tying the decision to artificial intelligence. Meta cut 8,000. Microsoft pushed out thousands more, and the damage is landing hardest on the people just starting out. Entry-level job postings have fallen by roughly a third since early 2023. A study from Stanford found that workers between 22 and 25 in the jobs most exposed to AI saw their employment drop 13%, even as their older colleagues in the very same roles kept growing. The bottom rung of the career ladder, the one every young person needs to climb, is being quietly sawed off. What makes this wave different from every past round of automation is its speed and its target. Earlier technology mostly replaced physical labor on factory floors over the course of decades. This one is coming for the white-collar desk jobs, the ones a college education was supposed to protect, and it is doing it in months, not generations. Postings for software developers, once among the safest careers in America, have fallen more than a third below their pre-pandemic level. Job cuts in the technology sector ran far above last year's pace. Meanwhile, the share of job listings that even mention AI has climbed to a record, a quiet signal of which way the wind is now blowing. Sit with what this means for a family trying to plan a future. For decades, the advice was simple and trustworthy. Steer your kids toward the skilled, educated professions, and they will be safe. That advice is now genuinely uncertain for the first time in living memory. The entry-level analyst job, the junior coding job, the first rung in accounting and customer service and marketing, these are exactly the roles a machine can now do for a fraction of the cost. When the path that was supposed to be the safest suddenly becomes one of the most exposed, an entire generation is left staring at a future nobody prepared them for, and nobody can quite promise them anymore. Worse still, there is no safety net built for a disruption that moves this fast. The comforting answer politicians always reach for is retraining, the idea that displaced workers will simply learn new skills and move into new jobs. But that answer assumes there is somewhere safe to move to, and when the technology is coming for the cognitive white-collar work itself, the ground keeps shifting underneath the retraining. Tell a laid-off analyst to learn to code, and the coding jobs are vanishing too. Meanwhile, the productivity gains from all this automation flow almost entirely to the companies and shareholders at the top, not to the workers being displaced. So the country is running a dangerous experiment in real time, handing enormous new power to a handful of corporations while quietly pulling the bottom rungs out from under its own young people and simply hoping it all works out. Hope is not a plan, and the families living through it can feel the absence of one. For 3 generations, the deal in this country was simple and reliable. Get the degree, and you get ahead. Work hard in school, take on the loans if you have to, and a better life waits on the other side. That deal is now visibly breaking, and the numbers prove it. The unemployment rate for recent college graduates, the people aged 22 to 27, has climbed to 5.6%, which is higher than the unemployment rate for the general population. Read that again. After everything you were told, a fresh college degree now leaves you more likely to be unemployed than the average worker, not less. The premium that diploma was supposed to guarantee has inverted. It gets worse for those who do find work. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York reports that more than 41% of recent graduates are underemployed, working jobs that never required a degree in the first place, while still carrying the debt that degree cost them. And that debt is now detonating. After the long pandemic pause on student loan payments finally ended, delinquencies came roaring back. By early 2026, more than 10% of all student loan balances were seriously past due, the highest level since 2020. When those missed payments hit the credit bureaus, the damage was instant and brutal. Around 2 million borrowers saw their credit scores crater by roughly 100 points almost overnight, dropping them from good credit into subprime. A whole generation that did exactly what it was told is now being financially punished for it. Weigh the full size of that broken bargain. Americans now owe more than $1.6 trillion in student debt, spread across some 43 million borrowers, and the rules around repaying it are getting harsher, not gentler. After the long payment pause ended, roughly 2.6 million borrowers fell so far behind that they were referred to the government's default resolution process. For the people hit by a new delinquency, the average credit score fell by more than 60 points in a single stroke. Understand what a credit score collapse like that does to a young life, because the consequences cascade for years. A score that drops into subprime makes the car loan far more expensive, makes the apartment harder to rent, and can quietly sink a mortgage application or even cost someone a job, since many employers check credit before they hire. So a generation that was told education was the ticket to the middle class is now discovering that the ticket came with a lifelong anchor attached. They are not buying first homes, not starting families, not building the wealth their parents built at the same age, because the debt that was supposed to lift them up is instead holding them under. The promise was upward mobility. The reality for far too many has become a slow financial sentence. Ask any young couple in America today what the dream of owning a home actually costs, and watch their faces. For most of this country's history, a house was the great wealth-building machine of the middle class, the way ordinary families turned a paycheck into security and something to pass down. That machine has been switched off. In May 2026, the median price of an existing home hit a record $429,300, and the average 30-year mortgage rate sat near 6.5%. Put those together and the math becomes impossible for most working families. Consider what it now takes. An analysis by Redfin found that a household needs to earn roughly $116,780 a year to comfortably afford the typical American home. The actual median household income is closer to $88,000. That is a $30,000 gap between what families earn and what they need, and it means a median income household is now priced out of buying in 41 of the 49 largest cities in the country. The ratio of home prices to incomes has hit a record high. The result is a generation locked out. By the National Association of Realtors' own survey, the share of first-time buyers has fallen to a record low of just 21% of the market, and the typical first-time buyer is now around 40 years old, when a generation ago they were in their late 20s. Among Americans under 35, the homeownership rate has slid to under 37%. The single most reliable path into the middle class has been quietly bricked up. Trace how far this has drifted from anything normal, and the scale is staggering. For most of American history, a home costs somewhere around 2 to 3 times a family's annual income. That ratio has now hit a record high of 5, and in 39 different metro areas, it has climbed even past that, up from just 15 such markets in 2019. We have blown clean through every historical benchmark of what a country can call affordable. Part of the problem is that there simply are not enough homes. By some estimates, the nation is short nearly 5 million houses, a hole so deep that even a building boom would take years to fill. Consider what a locked door like that does to a generation over time. A home was never just 4 walls and a roof. It was the forced savings account that quietly grew in the background while you lived your life, the single most dependable way ordinary families built wealth and handed something down to their children. Cut people off from it, and you cut them off from the future it represented. The young couple paying ever-rising rent is pouring money into their landlord's equity instead of their own, enriching someone else's wealth while building none of their own. Meanwhile, the older Americans who bought decades ago when homes were cheap have watched their property values soar into the hundreds of thousands simply for having been born at the right time. The ladder did not just get harder to climb. For millions, the bottom rungs were removed entirely. Imagine reaching the age of 40 before you can buy your first home, which is now the typical experience by the National Association of Realtors' own measure. A generation ago, people were buying in their late 20s, building equity through their 30s, and entering middle age with a real financial foundation underneath them. Now, those same years, the prime years for building wealth, are spent renting, paying down student debt, and watching home prices float further out of reach with each passing one. By the time many finally do buy, they have lost a decade or more of the equity their parents were already accumulating at the same age. That lost decade does not just vanish, it compounds. It means less wealth at retirement, less to help their own children with, less of the cushion that once let a middle-class family weather a crisis. The delay ripples forward across an entire lifetime and across the whole economy, because a generation that starts a decade behind tends to stay a decade behind. The American dream was never really about the house itself. It was about the security and the head start the house represented, and that head start has been quietly taken away. If you cannot buy, renting was supposed to be the safe, flexible fallback. Instead, it has become a trap of its own. According to Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, a record 22.6 million renter households, fully half of all renters in the country, are now cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income just to keep a roof overhead. More than 12 million of them are severely burdened, handing over more than half of everything they earn to the landlord. For the lowest-income renters, after they pay for housing and utilities, the median amount left over to cover food, transportation, medicine, and every other need in life is about $250 a month. Push that crisis far enough, and people stop having homes at all. The most recent count from the Department of Housing and Urban Development found that chronic homelessness climbed to an all-time record of more than 155,000 people, even as the overall figure dipped slightly from the prior year's record high. And a startling share of the people now sleeping in cars, shelters, and on couches are not who you might picture. They are working people. People with jobs who simply cannot make the rent. When a full-time worker can be one bad month away from losing the roof over their head, the most basic promise an economy can make, that work earns you shelter, has stopped being true. Behind those numbers are eviction courts filling up across the country. Roughly 1.23 million eviction cases were filed in 2025, and while the national figure has eased slightly from its peak, in many cities the filings are running far above anything that used to be normal, more than 70% above the historical average in a place like Denver. Every one of those filings is a family being told to pack up and go, often with nowhere obvious to land. Sit for a moment with the daily reality of a renter spending half their income on housing. After the rent and the utilities are paid, the typical low-income renter is left with around $250 a month to cover food, transportation, medicine, clothing, childcare, and every other expense life throws at them. $250 for everything else. There is no margin in a life like that, no cushion, no room for a single thing to go wrong. One unexpected car repair, one reduced shift, one medical bill, and the whole fragile structure tips over into crisis. Tens of millions of working Americans are now living exactly that way, balanced on a knife's edge, and the country has somehow decided to treat it as normal. When the paycheck runs out before the month does, Americans reach for one thing to fill the gap, and they are reaching for it in record amounts: debt. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York reports that total household debt has climbed to an all-time high of $18.79 trillion. The most dangerous corner of it is credit cards, where balances sit at over $1.25 trillion, carrying an average interest rate north of 21%. Run the math on a family carrying the average balance at that rate, and they are handing over thousands of dollars a year in interest alone, money that buys nothing, pays down nothing, and simply vanishes. The warning lights are flashing brightest in auto loans. Americans now owe a record $1.685 trillion on their cars, with the average new car payment climbing to a record $770 a month, and people are buckling under it. Subprime borrowers falling more than 60 days behind on their auto loans have hit roughly 6.9%, the highest level ever recorded in more than 3 decades of tracking. In 2025, lenders repossessed 1.73 million vehicles, the most since the depths of the 2009 financial crisis. Remember, in most of America, a car is not a luxury. It is how you get to the job that pays for everything else. When people start losing the very thing they need to keep earning, you are watching families who have already cut everything else to the bone and are still coming up short. There is even a whole new mountain of borrowing growing in the shadows, the kind that does not show up on the old measuring sticks. Buy now, pay later services, those tempting little split it into 4 payments buttons at checkout, have exploded into a $70 billion business with more than 90 million American users. Economists call it phantom debt, because so much of it stays invisible to the credit system. People are now financing groceries and everyday essentials in installments, and surveys show that more than a third of these users have already fallen behind on a payment. The official debt numbers, as alarming as they are, may be hiding the true depth of the strain. Follow how the trap actually closes on a family, because the mechanics are brutally simple. The paycheck does not stretch far enough, so the credit card covers the gap. Groceries one week, the electric bill the next. The balance grows, and now there is interest piled on top of it. So next month the hole is a little deeper, which means the card has to cover even more. Round and round, it spins. The borrowing feeding the interest, and the interest feeding the borrowing. The average household carrying a balance now owes close to $8,000 on their cards, and at today's rates, a chunk of every payment just disappears into interest. Buying nothing, paying down nothing. The same quiet desperation shows up in the repossession lots. When a family loses the car, they usually lose the job that depended on it, and then everything else unravels. People do not fall 60 days behind on a car payment because they are careless. They fall behind because the savings are gone, the wages are shrinking, and the $770 payment is the last domino standing. So when repossessions hit their highest level since 2009, the year the financial system nearly collapsed, that is not a statistic about reckless borrowers. It is a flashing signal that millions of working families have already cut everything else to the bone and are still coming up empty at the end of the month. Stack the buy now, pay later borrowing on top, and the hidden strain grows deeper still. More than 90 million Americans now use these services, and a growing share are reaching for them to cover not televisions or furniture but groceries and everyday essentials, the basic cost of staying alive, split into 4 payments. Because so much of this debt never appears on a traditional credit report, the official figures almost certainly understate how stretched households really are. Surveys already show that more than a third of these users have fallen behind on a payment. What you are watching is an entire population quietly financing its own survival, papering over the gap between what they earn and what they need with one more form of borrowing, until the borrowing itself becomes the crisis. Debt is a useful tool when you are climbing towards something better. It becomes a slow trap when you are simply trying to survive the month. And for far too many families, it has quietly become the second thing. Here is the simple test that exposes just how fragile all of this has become. Forget the long-term planning for a moment and ask a brutal basic question. If a surprise $1,000 bill landed on your kitchen table tomorrow, could you pay it without borrowing? For most of the country, the answer is no. Bankrate's 2026 survey found that 59% of Americans could not cover a $1,000 emergency from savings. Nearly a quarter of the country has no emergency savings at all. None. $0 standing between them and the next piece of bad luck. It is no mystery why those cushions are gone, because there is simply nothing left to save. The personal saving rate fell to just 2.6% in the spring of 2026, the lowest since the middle of 2022. A financially healthy country saves somewhere between 7 and 9% of its income. Americans are now setting aside barely a third of that, 3 pennies on the dollar, swallowed by the rising cost of getting from one paycheck to the next. The long-term picture is even bleaker. The Federal Reserve's own data shows that roughly half of American households have nothing saved for retirement at all, walking toward old age with no plan and no safety net. And the breaking point is already showing up in the courts. Bankruptcy filings jumped 11% in 2025, with the most severe kind, the Chapter 7 liquidations that wipe out everything, climbing 15%. The system is starting to buckle under the weight. The long game looks even grimmer than the day-to-day scramble. The typical American has only around $87,000 saved for retirement, and even for those standing right at the edge of it, Americans in their late 50s and early 60s, the median nest egg is roughly $185,000. Surveys find that people believe they will actually need somewhere north of $800,000 to retire comfortably. The gap between what families have and what they will need is a chasm hundreds of thousands of dollars wide, and well over half of workers already say they are behind schedule. Translate those numbers into human lives, because that is where they land. It means a vast wave of Americans is going to reach their 60s and 70s and discover they simply cannot afford to stop working. They will keep clocking in deep into old age, not by choice but because the alternative is poverty. They will lean on adult children who are already stretched to breaking. They will ration medication and downsize their lives. The comfortable, dignified retirement that was once considered the normal reward for a lifetime of labor is quietly becoming a luxury reserved for the few, and tens of millions of people are sleepwalking toward a cliff they cannot yet see. Run the emergency scenario in your own head for a moment, because this is where the fragility becomes real. The check engine light comes on, and the repair is $1,100. Or the tooth cracks, or the water heater dies, or a few days of missed work suddenly punch a hole in the month. For most of American history, a modest emergency like that was an annoyance you absorbed and moved on from. Today, for more than half the country, it is a genuine crisis that forces an impossible choice. Which bill do I skip? Which card do I max out? What do I let slide? That single unexpected expense can be the first domino, the one that tips a barely balanced household into late fees, then deeper debt, then real trouble. And life, given enough time, always sends that expense eventually. Living without any cushion is not just stressful, it is a state of permanent low-grade emergency. The constant background hum of knowing that one piece of ordinary bad luck could knock everything over. Tens of millions of hard-working Americans now live their entire financial lives in exactly that state, one unlucky Tuesday away from disaster. Now layer on something genuinely cruel. At the exact moment that hardship is rising, the safety net that catches the most vulnerable is being pulled away. The Department of Agriculture's data shows that nearly 48 million Americans lived in food-insecure households, including more than 14 million children, kids growing up in homes where there is not always enough to eat. And into that reality, sweeping new legislation has slashed the food assistance program most people still call food stamps. In just the months after the law passed, enrollment dropped by more than 4 million people as stricter rules kicked in, with $186 billion set to be cut from the program over the coming decade, the deepest cut in its history. The result is showing up at food banks across the country, which are reporting record demand even as their federal support shrinks. One major food bank went from feeding around 110,000 people a week to 170,000, and the strain reaches into healthcare too, where roughly 100 million Americans are now carrying some form of medical debt, owing a combined total of nearly $200 billion. In what is supposed to be the wealthiest nation on earth, getting sick has become one of the fastest ways to go broke, and being broke has become one of the fastest ways to get sick. The two have been chained together, and that chain is dragging millions of families under. The timing of these cuts is what makes them so devastating. The food assistance rollbacks did not arrive in some boom year when everyone had plenty. They arrived just as grocery prices hit record highs and wages fell behind inflation. The new rules expand work requirements to older Americans in their late 50s and early 60s, to parents of teenagers, even to veterans and the homeless, pushing the most vulnerable people off the rolls precisely when they need help most. This is not happening at the margins of society either. Roughly 1 in 3 Americans is now enrolled in at least one means-tested government program, and about 1 in 4 is on Medicaid. That is the real measure of how many families can no longer make it on their own. The cost is landing first, as it always does, on the children. Child poverty stands at over 13% today, which is roughly 2.5 times the record low the country briefly reached just a few years ago, before that support was allowed to expire. Think about that choice. We proved in real time that child poverty could be cut dramatically, and then we let it climb back up. A nation reveals what it truly values not in its speeches but in its numbers, and these numbers are telling a hard story about whose well-being this country has decided it can afford to neglect. Visit a food bank on a distribution day, and the abstraction vanishes in an instant. The lines are longer than they have been in years, and they are full of people who never imagined they would be standing in one. Working parents, retirees, families with 2 incomes who simply ran out of room in the budget. One major food bank described going from feeding roughly 110,000 people a week to 170,000, even as the federal support it relies on was being cut. Picture the quiet humiliation of a person who has worked their whole life, now standing in line for a box of groceries because the paycheck no longer reaches the end of the month. That is not a fringe event in a distant place. It is happening in every state, in cities and small towns alike, to people who look exactly like your neighbors, because many of them are hunger in the richest nation on earth is not a natural disaster. It is a choice, and right now the country is making the wrong one. The way Americans get sick deserves its own hard look, because medical debt here is unlike almost anywhere else in the developed world. In most wealthy countries, the phrase barely exists. Getting sick does not threaten to bankrupt you. In America, roughly 100 million people are now carrying some form of healthcare debt, owing a combined total approaching $200 billion, and several million of them owe more than $10,000 apiece. What makes this so uniquely cruel is that almost none of it is a choice. Nobody decides to get cancer. Nobody plans the car accident or the emergency appendectomy in the middle of the night. So a single stroke of bad health luck, the kind that eventually comes for everyone, can saddle a hard-working family with a debt that shadows them for years. Worse still, the fear of that debt makes people sicker. Surveys consistently find that large numbers of Americans skip doctor visits, ration their medication, and avoid the emergency room even when they probably should go, all to dodge a bill they cannot afford. A small problem caught early festers into a large one, which costs more and hurts more in the end. Getting sick has become one of the fastest ways to go broke, and being broke has become one of the fastest ways to get sick. Step back far enough, and the whole picture snaps into terrible focus. None of this is random. It is not bad luck spread evenly across the country. It is a deliberate, decades-long sorting, where the wealth this nation produces flows in one direction. The Federal Reserve's own figures show that the wealthiest 1% of American households now own 31.7% of all the wealth in the country, the highest share since records began in 1989. The bottom half of the entire country, some 65 million households, splits a pitiful 2.5%. To put it plainly, the richest 1% of Americans now hold roughly as much wealth as the entire bottom 90% combined. This is why your effort and your reward stopped matching up somewhere along the way. We now live in what economists openly call a K-shaped economy, where two Americas are moving in opposite directions at the same time. Over the past year, the spending of the top 20% of earners grew faster than inflation, so they are pulling ahead. The spending of the bottom 80% grew slower than inflation, which means in real terms, after accounting for rising prices, most of the country actually went backward. When you hear that consumer spending is holding up the economy, understand who is really doing the spending. It is not you, it is the people at the very top. And the whole fragile structure now leans on their continued good fortune. This level of concentration carries a historical echo, and it is not a comforting one. The last time wealth piled up at the very top this severely was the late 1920s, the Gilded Age, right before the Great Depression. For decades after that, the country deliberately built a broad middle class where prosperity was widely shared, and it became the envy of the world. That structure has been quietly dismantled. Much of the most recent surge happened during the pandemic years, when ordinary families were losing jobs and burning through savings while the value of stocks and homes exploded. And since the wealthy own the overwhelming majority of those assets, almost all of that new wealth flowed straight to them. Notice the hidden danger buried inside a K-shaped economy like this. When half of all spending depends on the richest households, and the wealth of those households depends heavily on a soaring stock market, the entire economy becomes balanced on a single point. If the market stumbles, the spending of the top tier could pull back sharply, and there is no longer a broad, healthy middle class underneath to cushion the fall, because that middle class has already been hollowed out. We have built a tower that looks impressive from a distance, but rests on a dangerously narrow base, and a tower like that does not bend in a strong wind. It topples. Live in the two Americas side by side for a moment, and the divide becomes painfully concrete. In one America, the stock portfolio is climbing, the home has doubled in value, the restaurant reservations are hard to get, and life has rarely felt better. In the other America, the rent eats half the paycheck, the car payment is one missed shift from disaster, and the kids are being raised on a tightening budget. These two countries occupy the same streets, shop at different ends of the same town, and increasingly do not even recognize each other's reality. The wealthiest 1% now hold a fortune of roughly $55 trillion, an amount so vast it is nearly equal to everything owned by the entire bottom 90% of the country combined. That is not the kind of gap a healthy, stable society runs. It is the kind that breeds resentment, distrust, and the slow unraveling of the sense that everyone is playing the same game by the same rules, because they no longer are. The same disease, eating away at household budgets, is also quietly eating the country itself. The federal government is now borrowing money at a pace that would terrify any family. The Treasury is taking on roughly $50 billion in new debt every single week, with the annual deficit running near $2 trillion. The total national debt has climbed toward $40 trillion, and here is the number that should genuinely alarm you. The interest payments alone on that debt have now reached about $1 trillion a year. The country is now spending more just to service its debt than it does on many of its core functions, and that figure is projected to keep climbing. The world has started to notice. In 2025, the ratings agency Moody's stripped the United States of its last perfect AAA credit rating, the final agency to do so, citing the ballooning debt and the soaring cost of paying for it. Meanwhile, the dollar's share of global reserves has slowly slipped from over 70% 2 decades ago to under 58% today. None of this means a collapse is coming tomorrow, and anyone who promises you a specific date is guessing. But the trajectory is unmistakable. A nation, like a family, cannot borrow ever larger sums forever without consequences eventually arriving. We are simply doing it on a scale so vast that most people cannot see the edges of it. Put that interest bill in perspective, and it becomes almost unimaginable. $1 trillion a year just to service the debt is more than the country spends on entire essential functions of government, and the forecasters expect it to roughly double over the next decade. Every one of those dollars is money that cannot go to anything else. Not to roads, not to schools, not to the safety net, not to lowering anyone's taxes. It is pure dead weight, the financial equivalent of a household whose minimum credit card payments have grown so large they swallow the paycheck before a single bill gets paid. The annual deficit is now running near 6% of the entire economy. In what is supposed to be peacetime with low unemployment, the kind of gap a country normally only runs in the depths of a war or a depression. Why does this eventually reach your kitchen table, even if it feels distant right now? Because a government drowning in interest payments has fewer and fewer options when the next real crisis hits. It has less room to cushion a recession, less room to respond to an emergency, and a growing temptation to either raise taxes or quietly let inflation erode the debt away, both of which land hardest on ordinary working people. The bill for decades of borrowing does not vanish. It gets handed to the next generation, with interest, and that generation is already the one being locked out of homes and buried in student debt. Look past your own street to the businesses lining it and you will see the same cracks spreading. Corporate bankruptcies in 2025 hit 785 filings, the highest annual total in 15 years, since the depths of the last great financial crisis. Even the luxury world is not immune. Saks Global, the parent company of Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, filed for bankruptcy in early 2026, buried under $4.7 billion in debt. Across the retail landscape, 2025 saw roughly 15,000 stores announce that they were closing their doors, nearly double the year before. Every one of those shuttered storefronts is a hole in a community and a stack of lost jobs for real people in real towns. The trouble runs deeper than retail, into the very foundations of the financial system. Office buildings, emptied out by the shift in how America works, are now sitting at a record vacancy rate of around 21%, with projections pointing even higher. The delinquency rate on the loans backing those offices has spiked faster than it did during the 2008 crisis. And much of that risk sits on the books of regional banks, the local and mid-sized lenders where commercial real estate makes up a far larger share of the balance sheet than at the big national banks. Add in a stock market, where a third of the entire S&P 500's value is now concentrated in just 7 enormous technology companies, and you have an economy balanced on a handful of pressure points, any one of which could buckle. The danger in those bank balance sheets is not abstract, and it is worth understanding why. Roughly 44% of the assets sitting on regional banks' books are tied to commercial real estate, nearly 5 times the exposure of the big national banks, and a wall of around $2 trillion in that debt is coming due and will need to be refinanced at much higher interest rates. If enough of those loans go bad, the regional banks that small businesses and local communities depend on get squeezed, and when banks get squeezed, they stop lending. Credit dries up for exactly the businesses and families who need it most, and a financial problem quietly becomes a Main Street problem. The strain is already visible in the broader numbers. Total bankruptcy filings across the country rose nearly 12% over the past year, and small business failures in particular have been climbing fast, with one key category of small business bankruptcy jumping more than a third. Step into any community and you can read the story in the storefronts, the shuttered restaurant, the empty big box store, the going out of business banner. Surveys now find that well over half of all consumers are deliberately cutting back their spending to cope with higher costs. When the customers pull back, the businesses they once supported begin to fail. Those failures cost jobs, and the lost jobs force even more families to pull back. That is how a slowdown feeds on itself, quietly, one closed door at a time. Notice, too, how much of the entire economy now rides on just a handful of stocks. 7 enormous technology companies have swollen to roughly a third of the total value of the S&P 500, a combined worth in the trillions, an unprecedented concentration. If that sounds like an abstract Wall Street concern, remember that your retirement account is almost certainly riding on those same few names, whether you chose them or not, because they dominate the index funds that hold most Americans' savings. So the fortunes of your 401k, the spending of the wealthy, and the stability of the whole market have all been lashed together to the same small group of companies. When everything depends on a handful of pressure points holding, you do not have a sturdy economy. You have a precarious one where a stumble in just one corner could ripple outward and reach all the way to the savings of people who never owned a single share directly. Concentration like that is not strength. It is fragility wearing a mask. There is one last set of numbers, and they may be the most haunting of all, because they measure not just the economy, but the spirit of the country. In 2024, the American fertility rate fell below 1.6 children per woman for the first time in recorded history, far beneath the level needed to sustain a population. Young people are looking at the cost of a home, the cost of childcare, the weight of their debt, and quietly deciding they cannot afford to build the families they once dreamed of. At the same time, nearly 1 in 4 American adults reported experiencing a mental illness in the past year. When a society becomes too expensive and too uncertain for its own people to comfortably raise the next generation, something has gone wrong that no quarterly economic report will ever fully capture. These are not just dry statistics about birth rates and diagnoses. They are the sound of a country losing faith in its own future. When young people delay or abandon the dream of having children, they are not making a careless choice. They are doing honest math, looking at the price of a home they cannot buy, the childcare they cannot afford, and the debt already on their backs, and concluding they simply cannot give a child the life they would want to. Provisional figures show births fell again in 2025, the continuation of a long, steady slide. A nation that becomes too expensive for its own people to comfortably start families is a nation quietly choosing to shrink. The despair is showing up in the mind too, not only in the wallet. Nearly 1 in 4 American adults reported experiencing a mental illness in the past year, and the rates are highest among the young, the very people staring down the most uncertain future this country has offered in generations. It is not hard to connect the dots. Constant financial stress, the grinding sense of running hard and falling behind, the loss of the milestones that once gave life structure, a home, a stable career, a family, all of it takes a measurable toll on the human spirit. People are working longer hours and feeling lonelier. They are more connected by technology and more isolated in their actual lives. A country can look prosperous on paper while the people inside it are quietly struggling to hold themselves together, and that gap between the official prosperity and the private suffering may be the truest measure of all that something has gone wrong. An economy is supposed to serve human flourishing. When it starts grinding that flourishing down instead, the numbers on the spreadsheet have lost the plot entirely. None of this, though, means you should give up, and that matters more than any single number on this list. The point of laying all of it bare is not to drown you in despair. It is the opposite. Millions of people are quietly blaming themselves for struggles that were never their fault, lying awake convinced that if they had only budgeted a little better or worked a little harder, they would not be drowning. That guilt is misplaced, and it is exactly how the larger problem stays hidden. What you are feeling is not personal failure. It is the predictable result of a system that has been bending against ordinary families for decades, and the first step to ever changing it is for enough people to see it clearly and refuse to look away. Ladies and gentlemen, when you put all of these pieces on the table at once, the pattern becomes impossible to deny. The record low confidence, the inflation that came back, the wages that cannot keep up, the job market that looks fine and feels like quicksand, the young people locked out of homes and buried in debt, the vanishing savings, the record bankruptcies, the safety net being cut, the wealth flowing relentlessly to the top, and a country borrowing $50 billion a week just to keep the lights on. These are not separate problems. They are symptoms of one single, deeper sickness, the slow unwinding of a promise this country made to ordinary people, the promise that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can build a decent and secure life. That promise is breaking, and you can feel it breaking, no matter how many cheerful headlines tell you otherwise. This is not a passing storm that will blow over if you simply wait long enough. It is a long, slow decline that has been building for decades, and the most honest thing anyone can tell you is that it is not finished yet. The numbers we have walked through today are alarming enough on their own. The harder truth is that, left on their current path, many of them are likely to get worse before they get better. Something is really wrong with America right now, and the first step to ever fixing it is having the courage to look at it clearly, exactly the way you just did. Watch the months ahead closely, because the path we are on does not bend on its own. The forces we have walked through, the climbing prices, the stalling wages, the mounting debt, the wealth flooding upward, are not random weather that will pass if we simply wait it out. They are the predictable results of choices made over decades, and they will keep producing the same outcomes until different choices are made. That is actually the hopeful part, as strange as it sounds, because what was built by decisions can be changed by decisions. None of this is a law of nature. The middle class that flourished in this country in the decades after the war did not appear by accident. It was deliberately built, and it can be rebuilt. But nothing changes while people are still convinced the problem is their own personal failure, suffering in silence, and blaming themselves. The change begins the moment enough people see the pattern clearly, name it honestly, and refuse to accept that this is simply the way things have to be. So now I want to hear from you, because your voice is the part no statistic can capture. Which of these did you feel the most in your own life this year? What does the economy actually look like where you live, in your town, at your own kitchen table? Drop a comment below and tell us, because you are living the real truth of this in a way no government report ever will. If this video put words to something you have been feeling for a long time, share it with the people you care about so they know they are not crazy and they are not alone. And if you have not already, subscribe to the channel, because this story is still being written, and you are going to want to see what comes next. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves out there.